ROAS was the big promise of retail media because everyone always asks, like, if I had an extra dollar, where would I put it?
I'm Danny from Flywheel. Very excited to talk about the big shift with Mike Feldman today. Mike, do you want to introduce yourself? And then I would love to hear your initial thoughts on this white paper that Flywheel just produced.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the aforementioned Mike Feldman. I've been in the commerce and retail media ecosystem for over a decade. And as I think about my journey, Flywheel has been a tremendous leader in that, really innovating early days of how to automate with Amazon and really take that to the next level. And so that's where, coming into the organization, I was so excited to read the big shift because, the only real constant in the retail media ecosystem is change. And so we're, seeing tremendous change, whether it's the explosion of different retail media networks to the abundance of data that we get to full funnel. And that's where I think the big shift was really interesting for me. One of the biggest pain points I hear from brands all the time is that their retail media spends are going up, but the value that they're getting is not necessarily correlated. And so I think really like ROAS, so return on ad spend, has created some really bad habits. And you're chasing this attributable short-term sale, but not really thinking about the North Star metrics of how you're driving, households, your units, and the overall return that you're getting from consumers. And so especially as marketers, we need to think about better ways to drive the business. And so it's some really digestible ways of how are we integrating full funnel using Amazon Marketing Cloud to providing better metrics. I teased it, but we really think about like return on consumer, how we're calculating that and using it as a way to drive the business.
My first job out of university was I worked as part of a marketing team and I was doing billboards on the side of a highway. It was highway billboards, and then it was also different signage in high school gymnasiums. And determining the ROI on a billboard is like impossible. There's no way. But eventually it all rolls back up to a CMO somewhere who had to say back up to shareholders or to an executive, I put $1 in and I got X back. And so it becomes nearly impossible to manage. I think ROAS has become that for a lot of brands where they say, well, this is how much I'm investing in this particular channel. This is what I'm getting back for it. So if you replace ROAS, what do you replace it with? I think you started to tease it, but talk a little bit more about that.
ROAS was the big promise of retail media because everyone always asks, like, if I had an extra dollar, where would I put it? It was one of the big reasons why brands then wanted to invest more in retail media is because like, hey, I can get return on ad spend on a daily, real-time, whatever basis, and use that to optimize to drive the business impact. But then I think as we, retail media has matured, we've gotten better metrics. I think ROAS is not necessarily holding up, especially, the easiest example would be like brand search versus category search. If I am, typing in my brand and bidding on that, I think most people can infer that probably the consumer was going to buy anyway. If someone is searching a very specific brand, then I would say they're likely to convert, whether there was a paid sponsored placement or an organic listing. They're trying to find that product and buy. And so that's where, in the industry, we talk so much about incrementality. So what purchases were incremental? Would they have purchased anyway? And sort of discounting some of those behaviors. And so I always look at incremental in some way. We see metrics like ROAS really popping up. What I really like and where we're innovating is the return on consumer. And so that's not like a metric you would see in the dashboard, but more of that mental model of how are we calculating what is the ultimate value that we're seeing. And so with advancements like Amazon Marketing Cloud, we're able to look at things on a consumer level to understand what is the long-term impact. And then especially now that they've rolled out like 5-year look backs, I remember in my early days, I was brand side and we were making a big bet on Amazon. And, a lot of it was couched in like back of the envelope math of like, oh, we're going to get these people and get them in the system. And, the returns will compound over time. But now more than ever, we're super accountable because we get these 5-year look backs so we can really see what the initial investments were and whether that truly did pay long-term dividends.
Yeah, you hit a couple really fascinating things that I think are top of mind for the industry. The metaphor for me in terms of ROAS is almost like the Indiana Jones metaphor where I enter into the cavern and there's the gem that's sitting, but I have to, if I remove it, I have to put like a sack of potatoes on top of it or else the whole thing will crumble. And I kind of think of some of these ROI metrics in that way. And so like even as ROAS graduated to iROAS, if I remove it from a brand and I give them the philosophy behind it, they're like, cool, but I can't report back to shareholders on philosophy. I have to be able to do something. You hit a really interesting point around MMMs. And I think that's the next chewable thing that a lot of brands have tried to say, well, I'll try an MMM. And I think the problem with a lot of MMMs to date have been that they are based on reach and frequency, but they're also very time dependent. They're 6 months in the past when they're no longer actionable. You mentioned incrementality. And so I want to tie these thoughts together in terms of MMMs and incrementality. We think of driving an action that might not have happened, or driving a new consumer that might not have touched, but that is usually just within that specific ecosystem. So a new consumer to Amazon may not be a new consumer to that brand. How do you try to square that circle in terms of true incrementality across multiple channels?
I would say if I could answer that question incredibly well, I would be doing I'd be doing awesome right now. I mean, that really is like one of the biggest questions. I would even say if you think about it on a macro brand media level, and that's why MMM became so valuable, because brands are looking for that common denominator data point. And so like, how do you compare across channels and truly understand the impact? And so that's where I think MMM became a really big part of the ecosystem for brands, because it's like, all right, do I put my next dollar in search, in social, in programmatic, in TV? And, I'd say again, to the challenges of its really long lead times, is it's expensive. It does not capture retail media particularly well, or, I would even argue digital more broadly, MMMs typically struggle. And so that's where, we saw more retail media popping up. I think to your point though, it becomes really interesting because like new to brand was a big metric that came out. And so, brands would get all excited about new to brand at Amazon, but really Amazon is capturing consumers. And in a lot of cases, you're probably trading someone from shopping at and I'll pick on Walmart, Kroger, Target, other retailers. And if they shift from a consumer buying those products at a brick and mortar retailer to buying on Amazon, it will show in the system as new to brand. And that doesn't necessarily mean it will be an incremental sale from the brand, because you're just trading share from one retailer to another. And so that's where I think, that's the issue that we really have to solve, frankly, is how are we looking across multiple retailers and providing that incremental impact, so that if it's not just new to brand at that retailer, it is new to brand for the brand holistically.
Yeah, I mean, this is the second iteration of the big shift. The first one was on that topic, which was the retailers that democratize data are the ones that are most likely to see returns back in terms of spend, because if I've got to report how my spend went, I need to be able to have some sort of metric back on it. And so that's where you're seeing a lot of that growth, where it feels like the new big shift is about that verticalization. This is actually one of the questions I want to start with you, but you kind of teed it up. What is retail media these days?
I define retail media as retailers monetizing their data or their properties. And so if we think about, we'll start with properties first, that's like, hey, do we have ad placements on site, in store, anything that they own? And I think properties even has expanded into what retail media is with. You think about like Amazon has Thursday Night Football and NBA rights now. Walmart is integrating Vizio as a new private label line, and I'm sure we'll see more like content opportunities there. And so really anything that the retailer owns is that property. And so monetizing that. The data piece also makes it really interesting with the definitions, because it's monetizing data on the front end for better targeting insights, things like that, and on the back end for better measurement. And so that can be anything from, hey, we're using these retail audiences, like people that buy a particular product, and we're using that in DSP and programmatic. So basically any channel, any media activity can now be retail media if it's using retail data. And so I've always liked that definition because it's sort of all encompassing, but it also shows you the complexity that retail media is, where it's everything from a sponsored ad, when someone is searching, to a Thursday Night Football spot, to even now like experiential, or how do we think about influencers and custom content? Like the list is ever expanding in what retail media is.
Talk about the impact that that has on brands. Because I think oftentimes the way that they fund some of these channels is historically coming from separate teams. There's like your trade or sales team that funds search and then conversion display. And then there's your brand team or marketing team that funds your big awareness activations. But to your point, it's all stemming from the same first party data set. It's all driving eventually to a place where people can buy stuff. So is that separation a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What should they do about it?
I think unequivocally retail media is breaking brand organizations. And for all the good reasons, right? Not even in the big shift, but we also have a retail disruption report, which I think it dives into this topic incredibly well. If you look at I'll use programmatic as a quick example. Programmatic has historically been a brand media activity because you're running ads, across the open web, you're targeting specific consumers, and, in most cases you're driving to a brand website or something like that. But now programmatic has become something that is a really large part of the retail media ecosystem. Everything from Amazon has Amazon DSP and their own DSP, Walmart white labeling Trade Desk to have Walmart DSP, and it's using retail data. Even take it, a step further, there's emerging platforms like Ripple. So that's part of Bridge and Cardlytics, where they're essentially working with the long tail of retail media networks to leverage their data for better programmatic segments. And so something like that is it doesn't necessarily count towards a retail media network JBP. It's using retail data. You're trying to drive these sales. And so that kind of activity typically is breaking organizations. Because if you think brand media teams are hey, I want to drive to a brand experience and I'm going to use a lot of off-platform. Retail media shopper marketing teams are I'm going to run on the retail site. I'm going to drive to a PDP or a retail experience. But those are continuously getting closer and closer and overlapping, especially from off-site and using data. I think at the end of the day, every brand organization is ultimately trying to drive the best business impact. And I would say for, most of our clients, it's, are we growing the number of units we're selling? Are we growing the number of households that are buying our brands and products? And so I tend to lean to most of our industry goes top down of brand into retail. I tend to love thinking about what is a bottom up retail approach, because then you're using all that great data. You're understanding sort of who is available, who are the highest potential audiences to buy. You're then getting really accountable sales-based metrics to drive that home and then continue to build up from there. But I think so much of our ecosystem is built on brand down. And I think with the advancements of retail media and how orgs are now having to think about it, especially with more, dollars tied, frankly, to retail media and JBPs and things like that, we need to be thinking about what is the bottom up approach. And I think that sort of is the inflection point that brands are seeing. And then ultimately, who owns what becomes a lovely internal challenge.
Well said. I think one of the pieces of the big shift that I've really enjoyed as we've been crafting has been the idea of consumer ID relative to SKU or product, which is one of the points that you were just making. It feels very bottom up. And I think that that's been a really interesting challenge because brands who have been exposed to that early have actually really liked it. Because in the end, a lot of what you're trying to do with your audience building is get product in front of people who are most likely to buy it. That's the same thing we're doing at the bottom of the funnel too. And so this is actually, it then raises another debate about the funnel in general. And I think there's been discussion over whether the funnel exists, whether it's circular and not actually funnel, or it's an infinity loop, or it's a constellation. The physical funnel, the version that we talk about, exists because it's the size of addressable audiences, right? So it's at the point of at the highest point of potential awareness, I can reach an audience of 10 million. Then I get into different levels of programmatic that are then 5 or 2 million people, or then into search, and there's 1 million people there. And so it creates this funnel or triangular shape. One of the points that was made in the article was actually that the funnel isn't disappearing relative to some of the way that we've seen the industry start to talk about it, but instead is just becoming a little bit more targeted towards certain behaviors. Can you talk a little bit more about that particular piece, reimagining what the funnel looks like? So rather than getting rid of the funnel, it's a shift in perspective around it.
The funnel catches some unwarranted flack in some cases, because I got to be honest, a funnel is a really great way to convey what we are ultimately trying to do. And I think where some people get lost is thinking about it purely as associating it essentially with the consumer journey. And I would say like consumer journey unequivocally has been disrupted. Like there is no linear path. I think if we think about the funnel, it's really like, how are you maximizing your most constrained resources? And so whether that is the dollars that you have in your marketing spend to, frankly, like from a supply chain, the number of products that you have that are available to sell, I think it's really interesting to look at, the sort of the bottom of your funnel like object is going to be your lowest hanging fruit, your highest potential audiences, your best, sort of bet for a return on what those investments are, the path of least resistance from a consumer experience. You're going to convert the most people. And then, yeah, to your point, it's like, that's where you can then expand to wider and wider audiences and groups. And I think funnel is a really great way to convey it personally. So like, I love looking at funnel, but then where I think we even prove out that from a media allocation, like I'm just talking on sort of consumer. If we think about a media allocation with Amazon Marketing Cloud, like we're looking a ton at the path to conversion. And I think that's where we see that, when we run video and display and search together, the holistic ability to integrate those is driving a net positive impact to the consumer. And so like when, we look at like different channel mixes through path to conversion metrics, if you're just running search, you are typically not getting the total amount of incremental sales that you would desire. But when you start adding in other channels and tactics, we're seeing that we're driving incremental households and revenue. And so that's where I think like one, we can see it from the data where as we're exposing consumers to more channels, that's where, maybe they are not searching our product category or our brand products. And that's where, video and display become really effective. And yeah, we're seeing it both in, again, from like where I'd make bets and investments. Funnel is a great way to look at it. And then, from a consumer journey, we do see that you're exposing net new audiences and then ultimately can bring them into those higher potential audience groups.
Yeah. And the eventual goal is find more people who buy more stuff over time.
Yes.
I think that's where everyone is trying to unlock the exact same thing. So it's really exciting. I think it's been really fun to kind of see that journey, especially I think for a lot of brands. The new wave of measurement that they're starting to latch onto has been the idea of long-term value. And so it's something that you touched on at the very beginning. But if you don't mind, I think you've hit it a couple of times in terms of the 5-year data set within Amazon Marketing Cloud, long-term value within consumers and within specific products for specific consumers. How do all of those things link together in a way that is specific to retail? How are you using those signals to then encourage more people who look like that?
So I was on the brand side, and the way we would make the business case, you think about like we just had Prime Day, Prime Week now, not that long ago. And if you look at it as just a short-term expense, like most brands struggle with the business case of like, hey, I'm going to deeply discount this product on a short-term sale. Like that might be not necessarily the most, positive ROI you're ever going to have is like, essentially give away the margin and a discount. But the bet that most organizations make is that we're going to get them sort of into the ecosystem, and then they are more likely to buy that item on repeat. Like if you think about where, most purchase journeys start from a online standpoint, it's like previous purchase history. And so if you lock them in, you sort of get that repeat. We used to make that business case for years and years and years. Now we've reached a point where we're approaching Prime Week and you can better quantify. You can look back at your last 5 Prime days to be like, what did we discount? Who did we convert? And then what was their repeat rate over the course of a year, 2 years, et cetera. And so I think we're much more accountable now that we have those kind of look back windows. It's not like, hey, believe us that, here's how consumers interact with online and we're going to sort of unlock this massive value. I think we're able to prove that, calculate it, and provide those business cases to brands now before making recommendations of like what items to discount and how much. I think that where that manifested this year was we saw more everyday items get put into discounts on Prime Day than ever before, where it's not just like this, hey, this really big ticket thing. I think brands are getting smarter on like where to lock in consumers and how to drive that long-term value. And so even the product assortment that are getting the discounts changed over time. Where I then take it, another step further is that all those audiences get put in and we can create custom audiences and things like AMC, Walmart, I'd say getting more sophisticated with what they're doing in Scintilla. And that's where we can then start to remarket them, upsell them other items in the portfolio, and really lock in their total value on the brand level versus even a specific product level.
The whole thing is constantly changing. The very last thing I will leave you with, and then we'll wrap up, is this is the second iteration of the big shift. In your head, where's the thing shifting? What's the third iteration going to look like?
Biggest shifts for me is, I'd say, one, and this is more of like an agency side of things. Like, I think the more that we are moving to a platform type ecosystem, the better. Retail media has created more data points than ever before. We think about the emergence of AI, which is taking lots and lots of data and making that really digestible and efficient ways to use. And so as we are developing better products and platforms to sort of meet the needs of the emerging retail media ecosystem. So I'd say, like, one, expanding across the funnel, connecting all those. We are at Flywheel really heavily leaned into building AMC specific products to even deliver on that. Where I get even then more excited is then like bringing in sort of AI to then, be able to buy in more efficient and effective ways, and even like move at the speed of retail or at the speed of light, frankly, in how we're going to market. Another big shift I see is I'm really interested in what's going on in the creator affiliate space. So if you think about like TikTok Shop, has gotten lots of headlines, emerging channel. The best way to drive TikTok shop sales is really through the creator affiliate program. And then if you think about that in retail media, Amazon has Amazon Associates. Right now, that is largely a program between Amazon and influencers, and there's not a ton of brand control, but we're starting to see those capabilities emerge. Walmart has leaned into Walmart Creator in a really incredible way. Like, one of my absolute favorite activations is you see like a Mr. Beast going in, and he, is shooting videos from inside of a Walmart, getting 100 million views. Like, that is your next version of a national TV spot. And so I think, like, how are we leveraging influencers and creators, which are going to be such a big part of our media ecosystem, to drive to specific retailers? Again, because like retail media has created this sales-based accountable metric. How are we taking this emerging sort of, media platform, and that being influencers and creators, and how are we pointing it at retail and accountable sales-based metrics so we can get the return on consumer, the ROI, the ROAS, the ROAS, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's going to be a really big shift coming up, is creator affiliates and how they play a role in retail media.
Awesome. Sounds good to me. Appreciate the time, Mike. Thank you. I had a good time. Hopefully you did too.
Very much same here.